Hello, everyone. This is Brother Nathan, or another heretic, whichever you prefer. Seems like a lot of people commenting on my videos lately prefer to call me another heretic, and that's fine. Whether they accept Paul as an apostle or whether they support the genocide that's raging over in Gaza and other places around the world, but particularly Gaza. These people despise the truth, but they're welcome here anyway, so long as they can comment and keep things, let's see, relevant to the video. If we can't stay on topic and you want to bring up other things unrelated to the upload, then that's going to be difficult, and I'll have to stop blocking, or I'll have to start blocking people. We want to stay on topic, and that's really all I ask. We can have our disagreements and do our name calling or whatever. None of that bothers me. None of that offends me. But if we can't stay on topic, then whatever. So anyhow, the topic of today's discussion is Chapter 15, The Madness of King George III. This is from Rulers of Evil by Tupper Saucy. If you're new to this series and you're wondering where you can find this for free, you can go to my website, one of my websites, anabaptistapologist.com. Click the library tab, scroll all the way down, and you will find Rulers of Evil by Tupper Saucy. For what it's worth, considering the fact that I mentioned the anti-Paul content, which I've spoken about briefly in the past, if you want, you can look at this piece of writing here on my website, The Weak Brethren Doubting Paul, or you can go to doubtingpaul.com, which is this website here. All of these points here are essays I've written in my quest for understanding who Paul is in relationship with Jesus or Yeshua and the 12. So if you're a Paulinist, I don't hate you. I just strongly disagree with you. And this is my case. It's written in the style of a letter, in outline format almost. So, and it's placed in, I think, a logical order. So it's there, it's free. I would encourage you to read through all of this before you talk with me about anything, or else I feel like we're going to be talking past one another. But yeah, if you want to know what I believe and why, all you have to do is go to anabaptistapologist.com and click around, read, and then we can go from there. But I'm not interested in being pulled back into the Christian cult. I'm very happy that I left. So if you think that you're going to convince me to come back or whatever because you think I've, quote, fallen from grace, well, then let me continue to fall, because I've never been more blessed in my life. Never been more free from addiction and doubt and all the other things that that I've been through when I was a Paulinist, when I was a Christian. So good luck. All right, Chapter 15, The Madness of King George III. Upon the death in 1732 of Thomas Howard, 8th Duke of Norfolk and real founder of American Freemasonry, the Norfolk title passed to Thomas's brother Edward. In a curious way, the 9th Duke of Norfolk played a part in the founding of the United States as well, albeit a cameo role. Sun-tzu wrote, multiply your spies, put them everywhere. In the very palace of the enemy prince, have a list of principal officers who are at his service. Know their first and last names, the number of their children, their relatives, their friends, their servants. Let nothing happen to them that is not known to you. So I'm going to pause here, and I'd like to say to the lady who was debating with me rather unsuccessfully about whether or not Israel's committing a genocide. She said that that I'm being persuaded by a Jesuit psyop to denounce the genocide. And but she's obviously uneducated and uninterested in the fact that Mossad and their motto, by deception wage war, is essentially the Jesuit motto and modus operandi, which I've shown is related to Paul's modus operandi, namely, I become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. So Paul, the proto-Jesuit, and then we have the Jesuits founded by Ignatius Loyola, and then we have Mossad basically saying and doing the same thing through deception, trying to conquer the world. So is it any wonder that this lady named Christine, who keeps trying to debate with me over whether or not what's happening in the Middle East is a Gaza or not, how silly and how ignorant. Don't come on my channel and tell me I don't know anything when I've read 158 pages so far of information that says very clearly otherwise. And it's not hard to connect the dots. Zionism is a tool of the Jesuits. Plain as simple. It has nothing to do with religion or spirituality, this scourge of Zionism. So go ahead. Support the genocide if you want, but you'll be sharing the same corner of the lake of fire as Benjamin Netanyahu and all those IDF soldiers. So you can't say I didn't warn you. But rather, I would love to see you repent and get on the right side of history and the right side of Abba. So, digression aside, continuing on here, it says, Edward, 9th Duke of Norfolk, was a regular in the crowd of Frederick William, Prince of Wales, and his princess, Augusta of Saxony. The Waleses were party creatures, and an ongoing disappointment to the prince's father, King George II. The king resented that his son appeared not to have inherited his craving for war. George II was the last British monarch who led his army into battle, which he did against the Spanish in 1739. George despised his son's Ignatian entourage. When Frederick William ran up an exorbitant tab entertaining foreign ambassadors at St. James's Palace, the king cut his allowance, shooed the ambassadors away, and ordered the couple to move out of St. James's and take up a simpler residency at Leicester House. In 1738, Augusta gave birth to a son, George William. At the age of 6, the child was placed under the tutelage of a Dr. Isco. Like the Society of Jesus, Isco did not wish the head of the Church of England well. Quote, he is chiefly remarkable, says Britannica, as an adherent of the opposition, end quote. Isco's role in history was to keep the future of the King of England, who suffered emotionally under the ungainly squabbles dividing father and grandfather, virtually illiterate for more than 5 years. The Prince of Wales was fond of horse racing. Once afternoon in 1747, so the official story goes, a sudden downpour of rain confined him and a handful of friends to his tent at Egham races. Determined to play cards, the prince sent Edward, 9th Duke of Norfolk, out in the rain to find someone to make up a whist party. The Duke returned with a strikingly handsome Scot, John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute. Bute immediately gained the favor of the prince and princess, says Britannica, and became the leading personages at their court. What Britannica omits saying, along with every other source I could find on this leading character in the formation of Anglo-American relations, is that Bute, like Norfolk, was a secret brother of the Lodge. This fact is ascertainable only from the keystone of the arch over Bute's mausoleum in St. Mary's Cemetery at Rothesay, Isle of Bute, in the Firth of Clyde, west of Glasgow. Carved into that keystone is a familiar Masonic disembodied all-seeing eye. Born in 1713, educated at Eton, Bute was elected in 1737 to the representative peerage for Scotland. He never opened his mouth in debate. When his bid for re-election failed, he returned to the family estate on the Isle of Bute, whose remarkably temperate climate produces a lush foliage, even palm trees. There he indulged a passion for botany that can be experienced to this day in the verdant grounds at Mount Rothesay. In 1745, Bute suddenly left Rothesay and took up residence in London. The year 1745 is distinguished by the so-called Jacobite rebellion, another wondrous sun-tzuan ruse in which apparent defeat for the Society of Jesus masked a hidden victory. The Jacobite rebellion aimed to restore Roman Catholic rule over England by deposing George II and replacing James II's grandson, Charles Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, on the throne. However, when Charlie marched on London with a band of Scottish devotees, no Catholic politician of any prominence would desert George II. The rebellion was forced to abort. Charlie escaped to France, and the Scots were massacred. Clearly, this was a Catholic disaster. Or was it? Such extensive Catholic support for a Protestant king assured England that the monarchy would be forever Protestant. A Catholic England was now an impossible dream. The Jesuits could give up. Englishmen could now relax with them in their midst, just as Jesuits could now go about their business without causing official alarm. The Jacobite rebellion made England at last safe for the Black Papacy. The Jesuits secured a new cover by blowing their cover. Blown cover as cover, in the parlance of CIA. The sun-tzuan general wins, whatever the circumstances. I'll pause here, and I'll say, if you think that the CIA is the only intelligence agency that operates under the Jesuit style, the Jesuit system, you're wrong. Mossad does as well. In fact, I would say every intelligence agency belonging to every nation under the sun has been infiltrated by Jesuits. That includes your blessed nation of Israel, Christine. So, again, be silent when such facts are presented to you. Answer not matters before you hear them. And stop supporting obvious, horrific, antichrist bloodshed, or face the judgment of God, just like the Jesuits that you're defending. Continuing to read, when Bute joined the court of the Prince and Princess of Wales, their son George William was an emotional basket case. Bute lavished attention on the lad, won his trust and admiration, became his mentor. Indeed, Bute made himself so delightfully indispensable around Leicester House that the prince appointed him in 1750 to the most intimate position on his staff, Lord of the Bedchamber. Nothing happened in the life of the two heirs to the throne of England that was not privy to a man under obedience to the unknown superior. But in the year following Bute's appointment, the prince died mysteriously at the age of 44. Rumors that Bute was responsible circulated for a while and evaporated. However, gossip linking Bute romantically to Princess Augusta never went away, even though he was husband to a devoted wife and happy family. George II, surprisingly desolate over the prince's untimely death, remained an absurdly stern grandfather to George William. Until his own death in 1760, George II grew increasingly melancholic and disinterested in ruling. Parliament gained strength. Bute acted the surrogate father to the future king. Caring for the gardens at Leicester House, he inspired the boy with a lifelong interest in botany. He encouraged him to patronize the arts. The composer Handel though blind, was still superintending performances of his works at the royal behest. However, Bute did little to allay George's tormenting fears of inadequacy. Reinforcing himself as the ideal of conduct, the Scot nourished the boy's self-distrust, which would become the most prominent feature of his maturity. Such was the context of English power when Lorenzo Ricci tipped the stones in the Ohio Valley that tumbled into a costly world war between England and France. 6 years into the war, George II died at the age of 77. He left behind a disunited parliament and a dysfunctional heir barely out of his teens. George William, now King George III, fearfully turned the British Empire over to John Stuart. Bute acted swiftly to conform to the wishes of his unknown superior. He began by appointing a more compliant First Lord of the Treasury, the office later to be known as Prime Minister. Next, with secretly funded grants, he purchased votes from key members of Parliament, widely known as the King's Friends, under the noble pretext of achieving a closer unity of the British Empire under Parliament. Bute whipped the King's Friends into passing a law to enforce writs of assistance across the Atlantic. These were revenue-raising warrants issued summarily under the royal seal, requiring a law officer to take possession of lands without trial, without jury. One does not need a doctorate in political science to know that summary expropriation is a sure way to divide an emperor, not unite it. When the writs were enforced in Massachusetts, James Otis resigned his advocate general's post in the Court of Admiralty to preach against them, quote, in a style of oratory. John Adams would later recall, quote, that I had never heard equaled in this or any other country. In July 1776, Adams would declare that the enforcement of Bute's writs of assistance in 1761 was, quote, the commencement of this controversy between Great Britain and America, end quote. Lorenzo Ricci's War, or the Maritime War, or the French and Indian Wars, came into the end of 1763. England was the apparent victor. Bute was sent by his protege, George III, to negotiate a peace in Paris. Assisted by Robert Petty, Lord Shelburne, the notorious Jesuit of Berkeley Square, Bute perfected the Treaty of Paris. Under its terms, England won from France all of Catholic Quebec and the region east of the Mississippi, except for the island of New Orleans. This was such a great territorial windfall for the colonists that North Carolinians created Butte County in the northeastern part of the colony. However, Bute restricted the windfall by ordering the infamous Royal Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited Americans from moving west of a line drawn along the crest of the Allegheny Mountains. Most colonists viewed the proclamation as a scheme to imprison them between the Alleghenies and the Atlantic. To purchasers of Western real estate prior to the treaty, it was legalized theft. The churchgoers saw a papal advance. Quote, within Roman Catholicism, no longer actively persecuted in England, many Americans concluded that the mother country was about to return to Rome. End quote. Prior to Lorenzo Ricci's ascension to the Black Papacy in 1758, the colonists had been blissfully loyal to the mother country. Looking back on the pre-Riccian years, while testifying before the House of Commons in 1766, Benjamin Franklin recalled that, quote, the colonists were governed by England at the expense only of a little pen, ink, and paper. They were led by a thread, end quote. Yet, with the rise of Ricci, as if in preparation for the absurdities of Bute, radical propagandists began appearing throughout the colonies. Christopher Gadsden in South Carolina, Cornelius Harnett in North Carolina, Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, and in Pennsylvania, Charles Thompson. The dean of all these propagandists was Samuel Adams, the celebrated father of the American Revolution, and Freemasonry's dominant figure in the mobilization of the Boston artisans and inland towns. John Adams, in a letter dated February 9, 1819, framed his cousin Sam's political activism with exactly the 17 years of Lorenzo Ricci's generalate. Quote, Samuel Adams, to my certain knowledge, from 1758 to 1775, that is, for 17 years, made it his constant rule to watch the rise of every brilliant genius, to seek his acquaintance, to court his friendship, to cultivate his natural feelings in favor of his native country, to warn him against the hostile designs of Great Britain, and to fix his affections and relations and reflections and to fix his affection and reflections on the side of his native country. Thus, well before the advent of much to rebel against, well before Bute's writs of assistance in the royal proclamation, a propaganda of American rebellion was being organized. At the same time, Dr. Franklin put together the means of disseminating it. He streamlined the colonial postal system to flow smoothly and efficiently from southern Virginia through eastern New England. On the diplomatic front, England's future war-making capability was stunted by the Paris negotiations of Bute and Shelburne, which isolated England from any possibility of forming helpful European alliances. This, in 1763, was of negligible importance to anyone but the foreknowing and omniscient Lorenzo Ricci. When the hour came for America to revolt for independence, and no one but Ricci knew when that hour would come, England had to be friendlessly alone. Having weakened England and stimulated the production of hostile, divisive rhetoric in America, Bute resigned from public life, a very unpopular man. But the king's mentor was not yet finished. From the shadows, Bute handpicked a new prime minister, George Grenville. Grenville made a broad show of refusing to accept office unless the king promised never again to employ Bute in office or seek his counsel. The king promised. Pledging to give the British Empire a thorough overhauling, Grenville then proceeded, with Bute's secret counsel and more money grants from the king's friends, to create dynamic situations that accelerated Britain and the colonies toward divorce. Duties were increased on colonial imports, justified by the notion that the colonies should contribute their fair share to the increased expenses of running an empire, much expanded by the Treaty of Paris. Higher duties heightened smuggling activities, which in turn increased the Admiralty caseload. Americans began sniffing tyranny in the breeze. Grenville's new Sugar and Molasses Act enforced ruinous duties on foreign staples necessary for rum making. The act reduced imports of sugar and molasses from the French, Spanish, and Dutch West Indies, which in turn greatly reduced the meat, fish, flour, horses, and lumber which the colonies could export to the islands. This caused a slump in colonial production. Large debts which colonists owed to their British creditors for furniture, clothing, ironware, pottery, jewelry, and many other articles went unpaid. Merchants complained that Parliament was killing the goose that laid the golden egg. Parliament's strange response was to prohibit the colonies from issuing paper currency to supply their lack of gold and silver. George Grenville did, however, invite the fuming colonists to propose suggestions for how they would like to be taxed. When the colonists refused to dignify the invitation with a response, Parliament in March 1765 passed, without debate or opposition, an even more infuriating measure. I'm going to pause here and just say, I hope you can understand, by now at least, what their modus operandi is. It is the Hegelian dialectic. It is problem, reaction, solution. They do this every single time. They're doing it abroad, everywhere, whether it's Ukraine, Gaza, Yemen, Libya, Syria, whether it's with the border crisis here in the United States. They create the problems that they can then drum up reaction and then present the solution. This is why we see Real ID. The UK right now is talking about digital ID because of the manufactured immigrant crisis over there. All of this stuff is not without purpose. All of this is because of the Jesuit secret intelligence agencies that are operating everything. So when you think of intelligence agencies like MI6, CIA, FBI, Mossad, whatever Russia has, whatever China has, all of these are essentially secret societies within the government. And then underneath that are the secret societies which put people into the government and into these agencies. So everything that you see right now is a Jesuit operation. Everything is a Jesuit psyop. And it's always at the expense of humanity. So for people to come onto my channel and tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about and support the destruction of humanity with the dropping of bombs and the firing of bullets and the torturing of men, women, and children, shame on you. You're blind. You're ignorant. You're wicked. I'm the one exposing the psyop. You're the one telling me not to. That I should side with this government or this government or that government or this government, when our allegiance should only be exclusively to the kingdom of Allah, the kingdom of God. It's a tale as old as time. Nothing is new under the sun. And if you don't understand that, you're the problem. This is very obvious. This is why I'm even taking the time to read through this with you so that you can understand the mechanisms of their deceit and destruction of humanity. But please, by all means, go ahead, hoist your flag, sing your songs, and pick a side. By any means, you're free to do that, but you're on the wrong side of history and you're on the wrong side of the creator. So I digress. Continuing here, the Stamp Act required the purchasing and fixing of stamps to all colonial deeds, leases, bills of sale, pamphlets, newspapers, advertisements, mortgages, wills, and contracts. If duties on sugar and molasses could be considered part of the regulation of the empire's trade, the Stamp Act was a tax levied by a body thousands of miles away for the sole purpose of raising a revenue. It affected all classes of colonists. Never before had Parliament dared to impose such a tax, whereas the duty on foreign molasses or anti-smuggling measures were felt only by the great merchants in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, or Charleston. The Stamp Act affected a wider public. It added the price of a stamp to the lawyer's bill of every colonist selling a horse, making a will, or mortgaging a house. The price of every newspaper was increased by the stated value of the stamp attached to it. In Massachusetts, Britannicus Americanus was one of Sam Adams' more than 20 pseudonyms, charged that it was as absurd for Parliament to tax the American people as it would be for an assembly of Americans to tax the people of England. In Virginia, Patrick Henry cried his slogan, "No taxation without representation." From the London Coffee House in Philadelphia, Charles Thompson led a secret club of workers, teachers, and merchants and professionals in advocating the production and sales of local goods strengthened by the intercolonial agreement not to import goods from Britain. A month before the first stamps arrived, Sam Adams agitated Massachusetts to hold a Stamp Act Congress, which convened at New York in October. The Congress drew up a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, protesting that the act threatened the liberties of the colonies. By the time the stamps arrived from England in November, the colonists had forced most of the stamp distributors to resign. The merchants of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia agreed not to import English goods, causing a decline in trade with Great Britain of about 25% within a year. In an address before the House of Commons, Benjamin Franklin issued his famous warning that if troops should be sent to the colonies to enforce the act, they will not find a revolution there, but might very well create one. Grenville's ministry suddenly fell to William Pitt and Lord Rockingham, who repealed the Stamp Act in March. The colonies rejoiced and pledged loyalty to George III. They hardly noticed that the king's friends had accompanied the repeal with a declaratory act claiming full power and authority to bind the colonies and people of America, subjects of the Crown of Great Britain in all cases whatsoever. Regarding Patrick Henry's objections to unfair taxation as so much nonsense, Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer, vowed to get, quote, plenty of revenue from the colonies, end quote. In the summer of 1776, he and the king's friends passed acts laying duties on glass, painter's colors, red and white, lead, paper, and tea shipped to America. But the acts produced little revenue. By Townshend's own estimate, made shortly before his premature death at 42, the British Treasury stood to gain no more than £40,000. The real covert purpose of the acts appears to have been not to get plenty of revenue, but to stimulate the rebellious investment of colonial capital in local manufacturing. In March of 1770, a small crowd of jeering Bostonians pelted a few British redcoats with snowballs. The angry redcoats fired into the crowd, killing 4 men, wounding several more. Let me pause here and just say, and how typical it is today for cops to be so offended at things that we say or do that are otherwise harmless that they just shoot us. And if you don't know what I'm talking about and you think that all cops are good, well, you need to spend a little more time awake rather than asleep and wise up to the fact that all cops are redcoats and they hate when you exercise our God-given freedoms, our God-given rights. So nothing is new under the sun. Essentially, everything is a psyop to divide us and conquer us and to keep us from thinking outside of the box, to keep us from thinking about alternatives and to fall for the control that they're seeking. So let's continue here. The town and surrounding countryside reacted enraged to the Boston Massacre. Samuel Adams led his disciples to the mansion of acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson and demanded the immediate deportation of the Redcoats, who wisely retreated to Castle William on the harbor. When news of the massacre reached England, the king's friends scolded Hutchinson's cowardly surrender to Adams's regiments. Thenceforth, each anniversary of the Boston Massacre became an occasion for Adams and others to make more blistering orations against British tyranny in favor of independence. In 1770, all this over some snowballs. I mean, that's part of it. You know, not to mention everything else that had been stoked and connived, but, you know, who knew that it's literal, that a little snowball gets rolling and it turns into a larger snowball as it goes down the side of this mountain of death. In 1770, Lord North, the new prime minister, declared the Townshend Acts were costing more to collect than the revenue was returning to the treasury. North secured the repeal of all the Townshend duties except a tax on tea for 3 pence a pound to prove Parliament had authority to tax the colonies. The colonists weren't affected by this minuscule tax, since most of their tea was smuggled in from Holland anyway. Feelings toward England turned amicable once again as colonial merchants increased orders from British firms from 1,336,122 pounds in 1769 to 4,200,000 pounds. Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, Charles Thomson, and Thomas Jefferson took advantage of the lull to agitate. Observing the first anniversary of the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1771, Adams called for action and solidarity. Quote, "It is high time for the people of this country explicitly to declare whether they will be free men or slaves. Let it be the topic of conversation in every social club. Let every town assemble. Let associations and combinations be everywhere set up to consult and recover our just rights." between 1770 and 1773. About the only troublesome confrontations were those between British revenue vessels and smugglers. The colonies began producing more. Trade was so brisk that merchants, formerly the chief opponents of British rule, had little to protest. They turned their full attention back to business. And then Lorenzo Ricci nudged his weightiest boulders to date, the religious right, the Protestant churchgoers. How he did this is the subject of our next chapter. All right. Well, what a great revelatory chapter again. Just more sneak peeks behind the conniving Freemason Jesuit leaders of the colonies and seeing how they agitated both sides in order to design their new world order here in the United States of America. How relevant everything is to today's current events, as I've tried to connect them as we read through this chapter. And we see even today a similar nudging of the religious right. Again, playing the violent and blind progressives against the violent and blind right, and stoking what many are calling an inevitable civil war amidst a growing World War III. Meanwhile, people with sense, people with brains, people with conscience do not involve themselves in party politics and in the fallen satanic kingdoms and nations of this world. Rather, we seek the true alternative. We seek absolute decentralization and commitment to the kingdom of God, which is within. Anyone else flirting with allegiance to the Republicans or the Democrats or the Libertarian parties or Zionism or this or that, or all of these movements, all of these squabbles, all of this is all by design. Only people of the actual truth and actual freedom seek to not be involved in any way in perpetuating those systems, but rather are only interested in exposing them, denouncing them, and decentralizing as much as possible. So, who can object to the beauty of that? And if you do, you're part of the problem. So, that is the end of chapter 15, Rulers of Evil. God willing, we'll be reading chapter 16 next time. Although this weekend I have, I think, a significant amount of free time, so perhaps we'll do other uploads in between these chapters. We shall see. Again, thank you for interacting and commenting and that sort of thing, but please try to keep things on topic. So yeah. Have a good day.